So it is my pleasure to introduce Geraldine Walsh, who I've known since I came here in 2009, where she was working for the Canadian Blood Services. But Geraldine received her PhD from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, in Dublin. You probably recognize the accent, possibly, with a thesis entitled New Insights into the Role of Nitric Oxide in Platelet Function. She came to Canada where she did her postdoc at UBC and then the Canadian Blood Services, and then continued on with some studies in platelets, and then was transitioned, continued to work for the Canadian Blood Services, actually. As a scientist and a writer, she's really very talented at speaking and at writing, and you'll hear a bit from that perspective. And now she is involved in scientific oversight for the Canadian Blood Services Product and Process Development Group, which I know as NetCAD, but that's her new position, but we see her lots, which is really, really great. And she's going to talk about something totally different. All right, so Geraldine.
Okay, well, thank you, Ed, for that kind introduction, and to the organizers for having me here. It really is an honor to be part of the lineup of this great symposium. And as you can see from the title of my slide, I'm here to talk to you about perspectives on my career path. And fair warning, as Ed said, it's going to be quite different from many of the other talks that we have here today. So, first of all, there is not going to be any data in my talk. In fact, it's going to be filled with anecdotes and my personal experiences and opinions, which is really the opposite of rigorous data. So bear that in mind. Secondly, I've decided to target the talk towards the trainees in the audience. So I know in this audience, there's obviously people at every different stage in their career path, but I'm targeting this toward the undergrads, the grad students, the postdocs, early career folks in the audience who maybe might benefit the most from what I want to share. So when I was given the topic of this talk, I really thought about how to structure it, and I reflected back on my career and thought about the things that I learned at various different stages in my career and how they served me as I tried to navigate forward in my career. And so that's how I've structured my talk today. I'm going to take you through some of the jobs I've had over the last few years and the things that I've learned in those positions. So, as Ed mentioned, I'm from Dublin in Ireland. I did my undergraduate degree at University College Dublin, and then I transitioned to a PhD at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. And that is a very well-marked trail between undergrad, then you go on to do your master's, your PhD, and then the next step is a postdoc. And everybody knows this path, it's very clear. And my transition from an undergrad to a postgraduate degree was also fairly straightforward, because I honestly kind of fell into the area, because at the time I finished my undergraduate degree, which was in pharmacology, the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland had gotten a load of funding for research trainees, and so I ended up in the clinical pharmacology department at the Royal College of Surgeons in a platelet biology lab. And, you know, I took the position. I thought the PI was very supportive. It was a great lab. The funding was abundant, which is wonderful. And the topic was something that was of interest to me, but I didn't really know so much about it. And that brings me to my first piece of advice, which is to find something that you love. So as I mentioned, I knew something about platelets and blood, but I didn't know so much. But the more I learned, the more I really love working with blood. And here I am many years later, still in the blood field. I just found it really fascinating. I loved the fact that to do my experiments, I just had to walk the halls and hassle people to donate blood to me, rather than deal with cell culture or mice or anything like that. So that was pretty great. And I just really liked that interaction as well. So the more I worked on blood, the more I really enjoyed it, and I loved working on platelets, the little non-cellular parts of blood that we all know so much about in this room, and their role in thrombosis and hemostasis. So through that work, I completed my PhD, and Ed has told you the title. It's essentially looking at biochemical mechanisms that underlie the activation of the platelet integrin alpha-2b beta-3. And when it came to thinking about my next step on my career path, having found this topic, I kind of knew I wasn't done with blood and platelets just yet. and that when I would move on, I would try to keep that going. But I did recognize one big thing that was lacking in my CV, and that was experience anywhere else other than in Dublin. So I decided that was the big change I was going to make. I was going to move somewhere else, get experience abroad, but I would stick with the same topic and stick with that classic path. I was going for a postdoc somewhere else in blood and platelets. And that's how I found myself in Vancouver in 2006, working at UBC. I was initially based at the Biomedical Research Centre, and my postdoctoral studies were on looking at the platelet storage lesion in blood platelet products for transfusion using proteomics mass spectrometry. And the first year of my postdoctoral studies was actually funded by Canadian Blood Services, and it was quite interesting to me because although I'd done a PhD on platelets, I actually I had no real knowledge of transfusion medicine or science. I had no idea about how platelets were used in medicine. I'd been really focused on the biochemistry underlying this little integrin, and it's very classic, I guess, for PhD studies to be very focused. But I really liked what I was learning about transfusion medicine and science and liked the applied nature of it, so that was a good fit for me. So I did about 4 years of postdoctoral work, and I want to share what I learned during that time. And the first thing that I think, or the main thing I learned from my postdoctoral work was to lean into your strengths. And what do I mean by strengths? I mean, you might think just something that you're good at. But I think that they can be defined as a little bit more than that. And I have the article I pulled this from linked there at the bottom if anybody's interested. So really, strengths are more than about just how well you perform a certain skill. They're also about how energized you feel when you're using that skill. And there's another element of the equation, which is how often you use it. Because if you have a skill that energizes you, but you never get to use it, then it's more of an untapped strength. So it's really about thinking about what it is that you do the most easily with the greatest joy. And for me, my postdoctoral work revealed to me that that was actually writing, which was kind of a surprise to me because I didn't think that would be the case. But I found myself just really enjoying a lot of the writing tasks that I ended up doing. It helped that I was enthusiastic about it. It helped that I was one of the few native English speakers in the lab that I was doing a postdoc in. And so I could fill my days with helping with OEB applications and grant applications and helping write the manuscripts. And I really got a lot from this to the point where I was really struggling to carve out time to do my experiments and spend time in the lab, which my supervisor didn't love. Although I think he appreciated the support with the writing. So I decided to lean into that as an area that I really enjoyed. And so I pursued ways to really explore this. So I took writing courses at the UBC Writing Centre and at other places. I became the editor of the Postdoctoral Association newsletter and just really tried to basically pad out this part of my CV to see whether it was something that I could essentially make a career out of. And so it helped me find my purpose. And I just want to mention that I think that purpose has carried with me since then. Like this idea of writing and communicating for impact has kind of been a pretty common theme throughout my career since then. And it might seem to fly in the face of other advice you might have heard, like to, overcome your weaknesses. And so I'm not suggesting that you don't do professional development, that you don't learn a new skill, learn that new programming language, take the leadership courses, do all of those things that you need to do to get better at your job or to get the next job that you need. But if you're thinking about your career as a whole and you want to have a career that is sustainable and satisfying, I think leaning into your strengths is really a piece of advice that I recommend you follow. So the other piece of advice that I want to give from this period of my career is to build relationships. So I had arrived in this country, I didn't know anybody, and we all know the importance of networking and building a strong network, and I think it's really vital to do that, but networking is really just the first step. If you build a network but you don't make stronger connections with people, in terms of your career, it's not going to really help you that much. So how do you go from just a network to relationships? It's really about authenticity, bringing your authentic self to the conversations, getting to know people and allowing them to get to know you. so that ultimately when it comes time that they might be looking for somebody or that they want to, recommend you, that kind of endorsement is really based on trust, and trust really comes from relationships, not just a passing acquaintance. So I think that's a really important aspect and challenging to do that, to build from just a network to building some strong relationships. But if you're lucky, those relationships can actually turn into mentorship type relationships. And I was incredibly lucky with the mentor that I had at this stage in my career, and that is, of course, somebody who's very well known to everybody here, Dr. Dana Devine. So, as I mentioned, in the early years of my postdoc work, I was working on platelets, and it was actually a collaborative project between my postdoc supervisor and Dana. And so I was going to the CBR, where I made lots of other great connections, and preparing my platelets in Dana's lab and working there. And even after that collaboration ended about halfway through my postdoc, I kept in touch with Dana. And when I look back on that time, I realized I had many frank conversations with her about challenges I was having, about what I wanted to do next. I talked to her about writing and how I was enjoying it and that it was an avenue I was pursuing. And, I didn't really think that much about those conversations at the time, but when it came to the end of my postdoc, Dana actually approached me and told me that she had an opportunity that she wanted me to consider, and that was to become a scientific writer for Canadian Blood Services, to write the backlog of unpublished papers that were coming out of our development group, which is the group I now currently work in. And so it was perfect. It was exactly what I was looking for. So I was obviously delighted, and I said, yes, absolutely, I will take on the role. And I couldn't believe my luck in getting this wonderful job. So to me, that marked the first time I stepped off that very defined path, undergrad, grad student, postdoc. And even though the work I was doing with writing scientific papers is very similar to lots of the work that people on that path do, there was one thing that really marked out for me how much I was stepping off that path, and that was the fact that I would be writing the papers, but I would not be getting authorship on the papers because I was a scientific writer. My role was acknowledged. I was paid by Canadian Blood Services, but I was not going to be an author because I did not fit the ICMJE criteria for authorship on scientific papers. So that really felt like a big leap off. I was no longer going to be racking up the currency of academia, peer-reviewed publications. But I was okay with that. It felt like a good move. So, what did I learn during my time as a scientific writer? I learned to value criticism, because I got a lot of it. So, you're writing a lot of papers, you're sending it out to the authors, you pour your heart and soul into it, and then they send it back and it's just like all red marks. You're like, no, I thought I did well. Or, we all know how it goes. You submit your papers and then the reviews come back, and the reviewers' comments can be pretty hard to take, or the rejection letters. So how did I deal with this? Well, the first thing I would advise everybody to do is avoid your initial reaction. My approach, which just evolved naturally, was see the email come in, open the email, glance through it, start to get really annoyed, a little bit mad and insulted, and then close my computer and go downstairs to Cafe Perugia and have a coffee or two, and then eventually come back and read it. And I think it's really important, actually, because your initial responses usually don't serve you in these situations. So you need to take the time to be able to take in that criticism and then use it, because usually criticism is actually constructive. People are just trying to help, and if you can take that slightly more generous mindset and think, how is this trying to help me? How is this trying to improve the publication or improve the paper or whatever it is? And then recognize the things in that are actionable and then take action on them, then you will end up with a better publication, a better grant, a better study. And so I think that's really valuable, and it's something that can be quite challenging, especially early stage. If you've been in this world for a long time, you figure this out. But for early stage folks, this is something that takes time. And I think it's a tough lesson to learn, but I'm only grateful for all of that feedback I received in those years. So this scientific writer role, it was a new role. There was no scientific writer before me. I essentially got handed a folder on the first day and was told, start writing papers, keep in touch with these people, figure it out. So I got to build the role myself, which was, a little bit intimidating, but generally I really enjoyed it, and I found it a really great experience. And I was essentially on my own. I was managing. I knew what I was supposed to do, but I had to build all the processes and everything that needed to be done to get the job done, to get the papers out. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of things, but things don't always stay the same, especially when you work for a big organization. And so there was a big reorganization at Canadian Blood Services several years after I'd started this role, and I moved from kind of being a lone operator to being part of a much larger group and being managed. And this was ultimately a great change for me because, again, I learned a lot from this. But change is hard, especially when you've been managing yourself for many years and building your own job. And that brings me to my next piece of advice, which is to remain flexible. So I don't know what happened to this tree. I don't know what forces were acting on this tree to make it grow like this, but it clearly remained flexible and survived. So I think that change is very hard. I find change very hard. I think most people find change hard. And I think the hardest change is change that you have no control over. And for that, honestly, I don't have any advice. I think it's very hard. But if there's change coming, or if you can see change coming, and if there's something that you can influence or control or be proactive about, then I think that's the best way to learn to manage change, is to be able to see what you can influence or how you can be proactive in ensuring the change is at least somewhat aligned with what you hope or what you want. And that was the case in this. I was involved in some of the decisions. I was still doing a lot of the same work I was doing. It was just kind of incrementally changing. I got to work as part of a team, and really the benefits of that were really great, and I learned a lot. And after a few years in this new role, my title still hadn't changed, but my job had changed completely. It was very, very different. So it was time for a new title, and I became a knowledge broker. And ultimately, this role really involved a lot of knowledge mobilization work and also science communication work. So I was writing way more blog posts than I was writing scientific papers. I was spending time with, in Canadian Blood Services, more time with the Public Affairs and Communications Department folks than with the scientists. And it was great because I learned an absolute ton from seeing all these different areas of the business that I was not exposed to when I was very focused on the science and the technical end of things. And so it's really rewarding, which brings me to my sixth piece of advice, which is to learn from those around you, especially when those around you are people with very different perspectives or opinions or experiences in life. So one of the aspects of my job as a knowledge broker was I was a knowledge broker for what was called the MSM research program, which began in around 2017. And this was a research program with funding from Health Canada that was administered by Canadian Blood Services in Quebec to fund the research to evolve the criteria in Canada that deferred sexually active men who have sex with men from donating blood. And so there was 19 research projects across Canada, and it was my role to help understand the research that was coming through and translate it so that change could happen. And this was very interesting because as part of this work, I got to interact with people from so many different backgrounds. I got to interact with stakeholders from patient groups, from 2S LGBTQIA plus groups, international experts in the field, regulators, as well as just many, many other people. So it was really interesting for me, and I really learned a lot in those times. And ultimately, I ended up on part of the project team that was tasked with implementing this at Canadian Blood Services. And again, this was, suddenly you're in meetings with like project managers and regulatory affairs and all sorts of people that I hadn't really interacted with before. And I just found this to be a really, really fascinating. It felt to me like a time not just of professional growth, but also personal growth. Like I could almost feel my horizons expanding during this time, and I think that was a really valuable experience. So any opportunity you have to interact with new people or do new things is really an opportunity to learn. So that brings me to my next piece of advice, which is to recognize where your gratification comes from. So this work that I did, the knowledge broker role and working on this file, was about 5 years in total. And it was really challenging work at times. It's some of the most challenging things that I've ever done, but it's also some of the most rewarding work that I've done. And when I look back on that time, I was a tiny cog in that giant machinery of change. But even though the role I played was very small, I really got a lot of gratification from this. And as that project was kind of coming to a close, it made me start to reflect on where my sources of gratification were going to come from in my role beyond this project, and also how my values were aligning with the work I was doing, and whether my strengths were really being utilized. And ultimately, it came to me that maybe I might be in need of a bit of a course correction, that things had drifted quite far away. So, which brings me to my, I think, final piece of advice, which is know when it's time to make a change. And as I said, change is hard. I don't really like change. But sometimes, as I said, if you times are busy, the days are full, you can keep chugging along. But if you take the time to reflect and realize that maybe your gratification isn't lining up anymore, or your values aren't lining up anymore, it's very good to recognize that it's time to make a change. And I think that in this, it can be helpful to engage, for example, a career coach to help you guide you through this type of work, because it can be very challenging to do that self-reflection yourself. So I just want to take a step back to how I imagined my career path when I was coming out of my undergraduate degree. It was kind of portrayed to me at that time that, you would do your undergrad. If you do a PhD, you have two options. You were either going to be in academia or you were going to be in industry. And you choose one path or another, and that's it. You're stuck on it for the rest of your life, and they will never, ever cross over again, and you'll never get to the other side of that canyon. Now, I don't think that was ever true, to be honest, and I know it's absolutely not true. So I just want to say that, it's more of a gentle valley between these things, and there's just so many other things that you can do in your career, and there's so many opportunities out there and ways to explore what you want to do that are outside of these kind of typical boxes that I hope are being less presented to students now than they were back when I was at undergraduate stage. Because I think that we're living in a very creative time. There's a lot of change happening. I have no idea what the workplace is going to look like in 10, 15 years' time, but I think there are opportunities as well to really create the kind of jobs and opportunities that you maybe wish to pursue, even if they don't already exist out there. So this takes me to my current path, which, as Ed mentioned, about 1.5 years ago now, I took on a development scientist role at Canadian Blood Services. So this was after my process of recognizing that I maybe needed to make a change, but recognizing that you need to make a change and making a change are two very different things. And it can be very challenging. So I'm very grateful to many people, some of whom were in this room, who helped me to make that change and encouraged me to see that I could make a change over what to me at that point kind of felt like the canyon that I showed you 2 slides ago, but really wasn't. It's just a gentle valley, and you can cross back into having moved so far away from the technical end of our business. The idea that I could move back there, and especially in light of having not had my names on any papers for a very long time, seemed quite insurmountable. But it turned out it was not insurmountable, and I can tell you that the path I'm on right now, working at NetCAD, supporting our product and process development, feels to me right now at this stage of my career to be exactly where I need to be. So I'm really thrilled to be doing it, and I don't know where this path is going to lead. It's been a bit rough, I'm not going to lie to you, but we'll see where it goes, and I'm excited to see where it ends up. So I just wanted to mention that this is not a piece of advice. This is just because I don't know how to do this. But I want to put it out there that one of the most important things for everybody in life is to strive for balance, and by that I mean work-life balance. Like learning how to say no, learning how to set boundaries. All of these things are so critical because ultimately you'll regret if you don't have balance, because at the end of the day, you know, your career is one thing, but your actual life might, you know, hopefully is coming from other sources. So if anybody's got any advice to share on this, I'm open to hear it because it's very hard to achieve balance, but I think it's really important. Don't forget it. Work to achieve that balance. It's going to be a lifetime of work to find the right balance, but I really encourage you all to do it. Okay, and that's it. Finally, I just wanted to dedicate this to Peter. Any questions?
Two questions. The first, you at the start of your career in Dublin, you mentioned something which is presumably fairly rare, which is abundant funding.
Yeah. Yes.
Was that because of Ireland's membership of the European Union?
I would say directly, but maybe indirectly, because it was the early 2000s. It was the Celtic Tiger years. And yes, a lot of the funding was EU-based funding. So yes, I guess it was. And then the College of Surgeons, it's a private medical school, and 75% of its students come from abroad. So it's also privately very well funded too. And then having this injection of other funds helped. Yeah, it was a period that I've not experienced since. It was 2001 to 2005 in Ireland. There was a lot of money floating around for research, like for antibodies. You didn't even have to ask. You could just order whatever you wanted. But it dried up. Around the time I left, it was already starting to dry up. And then in 2008, the economy crashed in Ireland. So it didn't last. I was just there at the right time.
Second question was when you were a scientific writer, you mentioned authorship. I mean, the cynical view would be that the vast majority of people on a paper don't really deserve to be there.
Yeah.
And it would seem to me that you make the case that scientific writers should be there. In some cases. Have you actually gone back on that and looked at the definitions and tried to modify them to allow people who are at the moment excluded to actually be part of the authorship?
No, I wouldn't actually advocate for that. So I used to also train the students on scientific writing, and I used to teach the authorship requirements that the ICMJE have, and I agree with them. I think that authorship should be based on, there's 4 criteria essentially, and you should meet all 4 of them. And I think that those are appropriate criteria to stop that real, that kind of, I guess, having a million authors on every paper. I did not meet those criteria in my role as a scientific writer for most of the papers. For some I did, and I did get authorship on 1 or 2 where I had made actually quite a bit of input into, say, data interpretation and data analysis, because depending on the stage it came to me at, that was sometimes part of my role. But if I didn't do that, then I did agree with those guidelines, because ultimately, yeah, I was usually handed the paper at the end of a study, so yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. I just have a question as a fellow blood scientist. It really resonated with me when you said that you really got siloed and sucked into your blood research. As many of us scientists are, we're very obsessive over our work, and we kind of really silo in on that pinpoint of our research. So I am going to ask you for one more token of advice.
Yes.
What advice can you give to the trainees here about learning to see the bigger picture of your science and of your work?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think actually forums like today are a great way to learn. If you get the opportunity to attend conferences or symposia, I think it really helps. But I see that a lot with graduate students that, and I mean, I was one of them too, that real focus without understanding the bigger picture. I mean, I think it's a role for supervisors as well to always ask, like, wait a minute, what does this mean? What kind of impact could this have, even if you're just going to speculate on what it could be way down the line? But without that in mind, I think it can be very easy to get led astray as well and forget about what it is that you're actually trying to do. So yeah, I'd say reading papers, conferences, and talking to people. I love that these symposia also have the patient perspective. That's really helpful too, to remind us of, I mean, ultimately, most of us are working on something that relates back to patients.
Dr. Walsh, that was amazing, and hopefully many more journeys for you to continue there. I adopt many of what you have just said, and I love it, but I can also, so I'm the total opposite. I literally did my undergrad at McMaster, and I'm a prof at McMaster, and everything in between has been McMaster.
Awesome.
But I would say, but the important part here, I think, and especially in the world we're living in right now, where you can network across the globe without moving too far, is that the advice that the pieces of advice that you give here is applicable anywhere. And,
I agree.
But they are certainly important to succeed, and the paths that you showed at the end, going through the valleys, do exist, even if you don't travel that far. So, and I can say that because I'm like literally the total opposite.
Well, don't tell my mum.
Yeah, no, I won't.
Because I told her I would only go to Canada for 2 years for a postdoc, and I would definitely come home after that. And that was 18 years ago, and she's still not super happy about that. So.
Well, Canada's lucky to have you, so.